Campbell County 911.
Oh, I killed my boyfriend in self-defense.
Okay, what's his name?
Ryan Carter posted. How sweet the sound that fades
And I shot him, I think I shot him twice. Thought he was completely dead and he was laying there still, twitching and making noises. And I shot him in the head.
I did. Yes, I did. I can't believe I did that.
On August 23, 2018, the courtroom fell into an uncomfortable silence. But one person couldn't stop laughing. Shayna Hubers sat at the defense table, a smile playing across her lips as prosecutors described how she had murdered her boyfriend 6 years earlier. She giggled. She smirked. She acted as though she were watching a comedy rather than facing a murder trial that would determine whether she'd spend the rest of her life behind bars. But Shayna Hubers wasn't the victim in that courtroom. She was the killer. And what she had done to 29-year-old attorney Ryan Poston was about to be revealed in excruciating, horrifying detail. This is the story of obsession, narcissism, and murder. And it all started with a single gunshot on an October evening in 2012.
Campbell County 911.
Oh, I killed my boyfriend in self-defense.
Okay, hold on. What did you kill him with?
A loaded gun in the house.
Can you tell me where the gun is right now?
A gun is in the house. I laid it on the bookshelf.
Where are you?
I'm standing about 10 feet from his dead body.
Okay, are you sure that he is dead?
He's dead, ma'am. He's completely dead. Ma'am, and then because he was twitching and I knew he was going to die anyway and he was making funny noises, I shot him a couple more times just to kill him because I knew he would have been.
I'm sorry, you said you shot him a couple more times after that?
Yeah,
How many times did you shoot him total?
I don't know.
Okay, because he was twitching and you knew he was going to die, so you shot him again?
I had to make sure he was dead because he was twitching so bad and I don't want you to lay there and twitch.
So you shot him instead of calling 911?
I did because I knew he was going to die anyway.
The dispatcher, trained to handle emergencies, later said the call disturbed her more than any she'd received in her career. Because the woman on the phone wasn't acting like someone who just killed in self-defense. She was acting like someone who'd accomplished exactly what she set out to do. Ryan Carter Poston was 29 years old and had the world at his fingertips. A graduate of the University of Kentucky College of Law, he'd landed a position at one of Cincinnati's most prestigious firms, Dieter's Law Office. His colleagues described him as brilliant, hardworking, and destined for partnership. He drove a BMW, wore expensive suits, and lived in that penthouse apartment overlooking the city where he practiced law. But beyond the professional success, Ryan was a son, a brother, a friend. His father would later describe him as someone who lit up every room he entered. His mother called him her golden boy, not because he was spoiled, but because he had a heart that matched his ambition. He volunteered at legal aid clinics. He mentored younger attorneys. And on that October evening, he had plans that would never come to fruition. Ryan had a date scheduled for that night with Audrey Bolte, who had competed for the Miss Ohio title.
Audrey Bolte, Ohio.
They'd met weeks earlier and had been texting, getting to know each other. Ryan was excited. Friends said he seemed lighter, happier than he'd been in months, because he'd finally done something he'd been trying to do for over a year. He'd ended his toxic relationship with Shayna Hubers, or so he thought. Shayna Michelle Hubers was 21 years old when she met Ryan Poston through Facebook in 2011. She was a psychology major at the University of Kentucky, intelligent, and from a comfortable upper-middle-class family in Kentucky. Those who knew her casually described her as confident, even charismatic. But those who knew her better saw something else, an intensity, an obsession with status and appearance, and an inability to hear the word no. The relationship between Ryan and Shayna was never stable. It was on again, off again from the start. But while Ryan saw it as casual, something he could walk away from when it became too much, Shayna saw it differently. She saw Ryan as her ticket to the life she wanted. A successful attorney, a luxury apartment, a future of country clubs and cocktail parties. And she was not going to let that go. Shayna would show up at his apartment uninvited. She'd call him dozens of times a day. When he didn't respond, she'd show up at his office. When he'd try to end things, she'd cry, threaten self-harm, or promise to change. And Ryan, kind-hearted Ryan, would relent, until the cycle started again. One friend later testified that Ryan had confided he was afraid of Shayna. Not physically afraid at first, but afraid of what she might do to herself or to his reputation. She'd threatened to tell his bosses lies about him. She'd threatened to ruin his career. She'd shown up at his apartment and refused to leave, forcing him to call building security. But Ryan kept giving her chances, kept trying to let her down easy, kept hoping she'd accept reality. That was his fatal mistake. By September 2012, Ryan had made up his mind. He was done. He'd met other women, started going on dates, and made it clear to Shayna that they were finished. She did not take it well. Text messages from this period show her desperation. She'd text him 40, 50 times in a day. When he wouldn't respond, she'd drive to his apartment. When he wouldn't let her in, she'd sit in the parking lot for hours. And then Ryan met Audrey Bolt. Beautiful, accomplished, stable. Everything Shayna wasn't. They'd made plans for October 12, 2012. Dinner and a movie. Ryan had told friends he was really looking forward to it, that he felt like he could finally move on. But Shayna knew about the date. Whether through social media stalking or mutual friends, she knew. And she couldn't let it happen. On October 12th, around 6:30 p.m., Shayna Hubers showed up at Ryan Poston's apartment. She wasn't invited. Ryan was getting ready for his date, scheduled for 8 p.m. He had an hour and a half to get her out of his apartment and get himself ready. But Shayna hadn't come there to talk. She'd come there to make sure that if she couldn't have Ryan Poston, no one else would either. What happened in apartment 803 between 6:30 and 9:12 p.m. would be reconstructed through forensic evidence, crime scene analysis, and most damningly, through Shayna Hubers' own words. Because Shayna couldn't help but talk, and in her talking, she revealed herself to be something far more terrifying than a woman who killed in self-defense. She revealed herself to be a woman who killed in cold blood and enjoyed it. According to the physical evidence, Ryan Poston was sitting at his dining room table when the first bullet struck him. He was not attacking Shayna. He was not advancing toward her. He was sitting down, likely trying to reason with her, trying to get her to leave so he could make his date. The bullet hit him in the torso. He lurched forward, trying to understand what had just happened. Shayna fired again, and again, and again. 6 shots total. 6 bullets from a .380 caliber handgun that Ryan himself had bought her months earlier when she claimed she was afraid to be alone. The irony was not lost on investigators. Ryan Poston had armed his own killer. The bullet trajectories told a story that Shayna would later try to deny. Ryan had been shot while seated. Then he'd been shot while trying to get away. The angle of the wounds showed he was moving away from her, not toward her. He was trying to escape. And then came the final shot. The kill shot. A bullet directly to his face at close range. The medical examiner would later testify that this shot was fired when Ryan was already on the ground, already dying. Shayna had stood over him and shot him in the face, and within minutes of doing so, she'd picked up her phone and called 911 with that eerie, calm voice.
I'm not a murderer, ma'am. I just killed him.
What happened exactly? What happened?
He beat me and carried me out of the house.
He did?
He beat me and tried to carry me out of the house, and I came back in to get my things, and he was right in front of me, and he reached down and grabbed the gun, and I grabbed it out of his hand and pulled the trigger.
Okay. All right. Do you need an ambulance? Have you been injured?
I'm not injured, ma'am. I was thrown into the side of the couch.
Okay. And then you had a history of domestic violence with him?
Yes.
So he slammed you into the couch, but you don't have any injuries?
I don't have any injuries. I was just very frightened. He's a lot bigger than me. He's 6'3", 200 pounds. I'm 5'8", 120. He threw me across the room, and I was very startled. I was laying on the floor.
Okay.
And I killed him.
When police arrived at 9:23 p.m., they found Ryan Poston dead on his dining room floor in a pool of blood. They found 6 shell casings scattered around the apartment, and they found Shayna Hubers sitting calmly on the couch, her hands in her lap, waiting. She had no visible injuries, no marks on her face, no bruises on her arms, no defensive wounds of any kind. For someone who claimed she'd just fought for her life against a man who outweighed her by 60 pounds, she looked remarkably unscathed. The officers asked her what happened, and Shayna, who would have been well within her rights to remain silent and ask for an attorney, immediately started talking. She couldn't help herself. She needed to control the narrative, to make sure everyone understood that she was the victim here. She told the officers that Ryan had been screaming at her, that he'd grabbed her by the shoulders and thrown her against the wall. She showed them where this alleged attack had occurred, but when officers examined the area, there was no damage to the wall, no scuff marks, no dents, nothing to indicate a violent struggle had taken place, and Shayna had no injuries consistent with being thrown against anything. They transported her to the Campbell County Police Department for questioning. In the back of the patrol car, officers later said she was calm. She asked about how the process would work. She asked if she'd be able to go home that night. She seemed genuinely confused about why this was such a big deal. After all, in her mind, she'd done what she had to do. She'd eliminated the problem. Why was everyone so upset? The interrogation of Shayna Hubers is one of the most disturbing pieces of footage in true crime history. Over the course of several hours, detectives watched as Shayna cycled through emotions like an actress trying on different roles. She'd cry one moment, laugh the next. She'd play the terrified victim, then the helpful witness, then the wronged girlfriend. But with each iteration, the mask slipped a little more. At first, she stuck to her story. Ryan had attacked her. She'd grabbed the gun in fear. She'd fired in self-defense. She demonstrated how he'd allegedly grabbed her, how she'd pulled the trigger almost by accident. The detectives nodded along, letting her talk, because they knew something she didn't. They'd already processed the crime scene. They already knew she was lying.
He had put his arm across the table, and there's a lamp, and he had put his arm across the table and had it in my face and was screaming at me at the top of his lungs after he had thrown me around the room, and was saying emotionally to me, and I shot him, I think I shot him twice, thought he was completely dead, and he was laying there still, twitching and making noises. And I shot him in the head. I hate you. I hate everything about you for what you are and my family. And he was screaming, and he had his hand on the table, and he wasn't completely standing up. He was like this. He was sitting, he was enough that when I shot him, he went like this. Literally. That's when I knew he was dead. or close to it, and twitching. And I let him, I still, even though it hurt, I still, enough of me, loved him.
As the interview progressed, the details of Shayna's story began to shift. In one version, Ryan grabbed her first. In another, he was yelling before he grabbed her. Then it was he threw something before he grabbed her. The timeline kept adjusting. The sequence of events kept changing. The detectives pressed her on these inconsistencies. Shayna, growing frustrated, began to show her true colors, and then came the moment that would define this case in the public consciousness. The moment that would go viral, be played in courtrooms, and shock even the most jaded true crime followers. A detective asked Shayna about the shot to Ryan's face. Why had she shot him there specifically? Shayna's response was delivered with a smile. "I shot him in the face," she said, "and I gave him the nose job he's always wanted."
One of our last conversations we had that was good was that he wants my best friend who's a dentist to do his veneers and wants to get a nose job. Just that kind of person. And I shot him right here. I gave him his nose job. He wanted some cooking. I'm not your typical murderer, not someone that you see on
The room went silent. The detective, a veteran of countless murder investigations, would later say that moment made his blood run cold. Because Ryan Poston had been self-conscious about his nose. He'd mentioned to friends, including Shayna, that he'd considered getting rhinoplasty someday. And Shayna had just admitted that she'd shot him in the face deliberately, mockingly referencing this insecurity even as he lay dead. But she wasn't done. She continued, explaining that at least now Ryan would have a symmetrical face in his casket. She said it would make for a better-looking corpse. The detective asked her to repeat herself, unable to believe what he was hearing. Shayna obliged, repeating the statement with the same casual cruelty. The lead detective, a man who'd investigated dozens of homicides, later testified that in that moment he knew exactly who he was dealing with. This wasn't a battered woman who'd snapped. This wasn't someone acting in fear. This was someone who'd murdered in cold blood and was now gloating about it. As the interrogation continued, Shayna's narcissism became impossible to ignore. She asked repeatedly how she looked. She wanted to know if her makeup was smeared. She asked if they could take a better mugshot because she didn't like the first one. She worried about what people would think of her. She worried about her reputation. At one point, she asked the detective if she'd be able to finish her psychology degree. She asked if this would affect her career prospects. She discussed her future as though Ryan's death was a minor inconvenience in her life plans, rather than a life she'd deliberately ended. Throughout the interrogation, Shayna would cry. But it wasn't the crying of someone in genuine distress. It was performative, theatrical. She'd sob dramatically when talking about how scared she'd been. But the moment the detectives left the room, body language experts later noted, her face would go completely blank. No tears, no emotion, just a cold, calculating expression. And when they returned, the tears would start again, right on cue. Eventually, confronted with the forensic evidence that contradicted her self-defense claim, Shayna adjusted her story again.
And I wasn't doing anything that was mean. I was begging him to stay in the relationship and be with me because I knew that we once really loved each other. Ryan had told me that he loved me and wanted to be with me. And I guess somewhere along the way, that grew to hate. He was screaming how much he hated me.
She admitted she'd shot Ryan 6 times. She admitted the last shot was to his face. But she maintained it was all justified because he'd made her do it by trying to break up with her. In her mind, his rejection was violence. His desire to date someone else was an attack. And therefore, her murder of him was simply fair. The detectives asked her directly, "Did you go to his apartment intending to kill him?" Shayna paused. And in that pause, you could see her calculating which answer would serve her best. Finally, she said, "I went there to talk to him, but I knew if he wouldn't listen, I'd have to do something to make him understand. That something was murder." And in that moment, however unintentionally, Shayna Hubers had just confessed to premeditated murder. Shayna Hubers was arrested and charged with murder. She was held without bond at the Campbell County Detention Center while awaiting trial. And this is where she made her biggest mistake. Because in Kentucky, like in many states, all phone calls made by inmates are recorded, and Shayna Hubers, who had already proven she couldn't stop talking, was about to hand the prosecution their entire case on a silver platter. Over the weeks and months following her arrest, Shayna made dozens of phone calls to family members, friends, and even some acquaintances. In these calls, with the prosecution listening to every word, Shayna revealed exactly who she was. And it was so much worse than anyone had imagined. In calls to her mother, Shayna complained about the jail conditions. The food was bad. Her cellmates were low class. The guards were rude to her. She lamented that her life was ruined, that this was so unfair, that Ryan had forced her hand. At no point did she express genuine remorse for taking a human life. At no point did she acknowledge the pain she'd caused Ryan's family. It was all about her suffering, her inconvenience, her ruined reputation. Shayna's cellmates would later testify that she was equally callous in person. She'd brag about the murder, about how she'd gotten rid of a problem. She'd show off newspaper articles about her case. She'd laugh when reading comments online calling her a monster. One cellmate testified that Shayna had said, "At least I'm famous now. People know my name." The narcissism was boundless. The Campbell County Commonwealth's attorney, Michelle Snodgrass, knew she had a strong case. The forensic evidence proved it wasn't self-defense. The interrogation showed Shayna's lack of remorse and her shifting stories. But these jailhouse recordings? These were gold. Because they showed premeditation. They showed a complete absence of remorse. They showed that Shayna Hubers knew exactly what she'd done and wasn't sorry. And in Kentucky, that meant she was facing life in prison. Shayna's defense attorneys had an impossible job. How do you defend someone who'd essentially confessed multiple times? Who'd been recorded bragging about the murder? Who'd shown zero remorse? Their strategy became to paint Ryan as abusive, to claim Shayna suffered from battered woman syndrome, and to argue that she'd feared for her life. But they had a problem. There was no evidence Ryan had ever been abusive. Not a single witness could testify to seeing Ryan hurt Shayna. No medical records. No police reports. Nothing. In April 2014, nearly 2 years after Ryan's murder, Shayna Hubers went to trial. The courthouse in Campbell County was packed with media, spectators, and most heartbreakingly, Ryan Poston's family. His mother, father, and siblings sat in the front row every single day, forced to relive their son's death through testimony, evidence, and those awful recordings. The prosecution's opening statement was devastating.
He lay twitching. It was too painful for her to watch him die. So she walked around the table and continued shooting him in places that she knew it would kill him.
They laid out a clear timeline. They explained how Shayna had become obsessed with Ryan, how he'd tried multiple times to end the relationship, how she'd known about his date with Audrey Bolt, how she'd gone to his apartment that evening not to talk, but to ensure he could never leave her for another woman. And if she couldn't have him, no one would. The defense countered by painting Shayna as a victim. They claimed Ryan had been emotionally abusive, that he'd manipulated her, that he'd been violent in the past. But as the trial progressed, none of these claims held up under scrutiny.
She sees his arm moving across the table towards a gun on the table. You'll hear that Mr. Poston had lots of guns and that this gun was right there. She picks it up and she starts shooting. And she ends up shooting 6 times.
Ryan's friends took the stand one by one. They testified about his character, his kindness, his ambition. They testified about how he'd confided his fear of Shayna, how she wouldn't leave him alone, how she'd threatened his career, how he'd finally found the courage to truly end things and move on. Audrey Bolt, Miss Ohio, testified about the date that was supposed to happen that evening.
He was very funny and very smart, and I found him very entertaining, and that led me to accept an invite to go on a date with him.
She described Ryan as sweet, respectful, and excited about their plans. She talked about receiving a call from police that night, informing her that Ryan was dead. The courtroom was silent as she wiped away tears. The prosecution's forensic experts methodically destroyed Shayna's self-defense claim. The coroner testified about the 6 gunshot wounds. He explained how the bullet trajectories proved Ryan had been shot while seated, then while trying to move away, then while on the ground. He showed autopsy photos that made several jurors visibly uncomfortable. There was no scenario, he said, in which these wounds were consistent with self-defense. A ballistics expert testified about the gun, the ammunition, and the firing sequence. He demonstrated how Shayna would have had to reload at one point to continue shooting. This wasn't a panicked person firing blindly. This was someone methodically executing another human being. The jury also watched the full interrogation video. They saw her change her story. They saw the fake tears. They saw her ask about her appearance. And they heard that chilling nose job comment. Several jurors later said that moment was when they knew they were dealing with someone truly dangerous. The defense called their own witnesses, including a psychologist who testified that Shayna suffered from trauma and had genuinely feared Ryan. But on cross-examination, the prosecution got the psychologist to admit that Shayna had shown signs of narcissistic personality disorder, not PTSD. Shayna Hubers had murdered Ryan Poston because she couldn't accept rejection. She'd gone to his apartment knowing what she was going to do. She'd fired 6 shots, stood over his dying body, and shot him in the face, and then she'd called 911 and performed the role of frightened victim. But the evidence didn't lie. The recordings didn't lie. Shayna Hubers was a murderer, and she deserved to spend the rest of her life in prison. On April 23, 2014, after just a few hours of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. Guilty of murder. She was sentenced to 40 years to life in prison. At sentencing, Ryan's family gave victim impact statements that left everyone in the courtroom in tears. His father described the son he'd lost, the future Ryan would never have. His mother could barely speak through her sobs. The judge, in imposing sentence, called Shayna's crime calculated cold-blooded murder and said her lack of remorse was chilling. It seemed justice had been served, but this story was far from over. In 2016, Shayna's appellate attorneys made a shocking discovery. One of the jurors who'd convicted her had failed to disclose during jury selection that he was a convicted felon. In Kentucky, convicted felons cannot serve on juries. This was automatic grounds for a mistrial. The conviction was overturned. Shayna Hubers would get a new trial. Ryan's family was devastated. They'd endured the trial, the testimony, the recordings. They'd watched justice being served. And now, they'd have to do it all over again. Shayna, meanwhile, seemed pleased with herself. Inmates who knew her said she bragged that she'd gotten away with it and would be acquitted at the second trial. In August 2018, 4 years after her first conviction, Shayna Hubers went to trial again. The prosecution's case was essentially the same, but refined. They knew exactly which pieces of evidence had been most effective. They knew how to present their case for maximum impact, and they were determined that this time the conviction would stick. But something had changed in Shayna. Perhaps emboldened by her successful appeal, perhaps believing she really would be acquitted this time, she stopped even pretending to be remorseful. Her courtroom behavior during the second trial was shocking even to those who'd watched the first trial. She smiled constantly. She laughed at inappropriate moments. When the prosecution played the 911 call, she smirked. When forensic testimony described Ryan's injuries, she appeared bored. When Ryan's family cried on the stand, she rolled her eyes. Shayna believed she was special, chosen, protected. In her mind, even the spirit world was on her side. On August 23, 2018, the jury in the second trial deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning their verdict. Guilty of murder. This time, there would be no appeal based on juror misconduct. This time, the conviction would stand. And this time, the judge had something to say about Shayna Hubers' behavior. The sentencing hearing took place a few weeks after the verdict. The courtroom was packed once again. Ryan's family prepared to give their victim impact statements for the second time. And Shayna Hubers, still convinced she was the victim, still unable to comprehend the gravity of what she'd done, sat at the defense table with that same inappropriate smile. Ryan's father spoke first. He described the 6 years since his son's death, the grief that never lessened, the holidays without Ryan, the career milestones Ryan would never achieve, the children he'd never have, the life stolen by a woman who couldn't accept the word no. "She took our son from us," he said, his voice breaking. "And she's never shown an ounce of true remorse. She's laughed. She's joked. She's treated this like it's all a game. But this isn't a game. This is our son's life. And it's over. Because of her." Ryan's mother spoke next, though she could barely get through her statement. She talked about the last time she'd seen Ryan alive, how he'd hugged her and told her he loved her. She talked about the phone call that every parent dreads, the one telling her that her child was gone. And she looked directly at Shayna and said, "You took the most precious thing in the world from me, and you don't even care." Shayna's expression didn't change. And then it was time for Judge Daniel Zala to impose sentence. But before he announced the sentence, he had something he needed to say. He looked directly at Shayna Hubers, and his voice was cold with controlled anger. "Ms. Hubers," he began, "in my 20 years on the bench, I have presided over many murder cases. I have seen defendants who were remorseful, defendants who were broken by what they'd done, defendants who understood the gravity of taking a human life. You are not one of those defendants." Shayna shifted in her seat, the smile finally fading. "Throughout this trial, you have shown nothing but contempt. Contempt for this court, contempt for the jury, contempt for the victim's family, and most disturbingly, contempt for the life you took. You have laughed during testimony about Ryan Poston's death. You have smiled while his family wept. You have treated these proceedings like theater, with yourself as the star. Your behavior in this courtroom has been nothing short of grotesque. When the prosecutor described how you stood over Ryan Poston's dying body and shot him in the face, you laughed. When his mother described her grief, you appeared bored. Ms. Hubers, you are not the victim here. You never were. Ryan Poston was the victim. He was a young man with his whole life ahead of him. He had done nothing wrong except try to end a relationship that had become toxic, and for that, you decided he deserved to die." The judge asked if Shayna had anything to say before being remanded to custody. Her attorney advised her to remain silent, but once again, Shayna couldn't help herself. She stood, straightened her jail uniform, and addressed the court. "I just want everyone to know that I never meant for any of this to happen. Ryan and I loved each other, and sometimes love makes people do things they wouldn't normally do. I hope someday everyone can understand that I was trying to protect myself, and—" The judge cut her off. "Ms. Hubers, you've said enough. More than enough. Officers, please remove the defendant." Shayna Michelle Hubers was sentenced to life in prison for the murder of Ryan Poston. She will be eligible for parole in 2032. Ryan Poston was 29 years old when he died. He will never get older. Shayna will spend the rest of her days paying for making sure of that. Today, Shayna Hubers sits in a Kentucky prison cell where she will remain for decades. Her laughter has been silenced by the weight of her actions. Her performance has ended, and Ryan Poston's family, while they will never fully heal from their loss, can find some measure of peace knowing that justice, though delayed, was ultimately served.